Hypoxia is defined as the deficiency of oxygen at the tissue level. It is one of the frequently asked long answer question in the university examination, and many questions can be framed from this part of respiration in the NEET PG. In this video, I am going to tell you what is hypoxia, what are its type, what is the treatment, and what is its effect on the cells. Hey everyone, welcome to HM Learnings. I am Harshita, the founder of HM Learnings, where students come to clear their concepts and to get the study material. Make sure that you have subscribed my channel. So let's start. Hypoxia is the deficiency of oxygen at the tissue level. Means the tissue is not getting the appropriate oxygen required for its normal functioning. We know that the oxygen is present in the atmosphere, and from the atmosphere it enters into our lung by the process of breathing. Now from the lungs the oxygen enters or diffuses into our blood, and then blood acts as a carrier for the transport of oxygen to each and every tissue in our body. So this is the whole pathway of the oxygen. So if we say that there is deficiency of the oxygen at the tissue level, means there must be a abnormality or there must be a defect at any step of this pathway. There could be decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, or there is a problem in the oxygenation and the diffusion at the lung, or there is decrease in the capacity of the blood to carry the oxygen, or it is possible that the tissue is not able to utilize the oxygen. So what are the causes of hypoxia and what are its type related to each and every defect in the pathway we will deal in the upcoming slide. So I have already explained you that the oxygen delivery to a particular tissue will depend upon the amount of oxygen entering the lungs, the adequacy of the respiratory as well as the cardiovascular system, and then the capacity of the blood to carry the oxygen, then ability of the tissue to utilize the oxygen. Then supply of the oxygen to the tissue will be affected by the alter in any of this step. So how the alteration in these steps will lead to hypoxia, we will now see. So before classifying the hypoxia, it is important to understand the basic regarding the oxygen transport. So we know that the oxygen is transported in the two ways, by the blood. So blood transport the oxygen in the dissolved form. The oxygen is dissolved in the plasma, or it can bind with the hemoglobin to form the oxyhemoglobin. So about 3% of the oxygen is transported in the dissolved form, and the remaining 97% of the oxygen is transported as the form of oxyhemoglobin. So if someone asks you what is the total arterial oxygen content, what will you say? Definitely it will be the addition of these two. That means the oxygen carried in the dissolved form plus the oxygen carried by the hemoglobin. So how you will calculate the oxygen carried in the dissolved form? It will be the multiplication of the partial pressure of the oxygen into the solubility coefficient of the oxygen. So solubility coefficient of the oxygen remains the same. It is a constant value. It is about 0.003 ml per 100 ml of blood per mmHg, plus the oxygen carried by the hemoglobin. So we can find out that by multiplying the hemoglobin concentration in 100 ml of the blood into the oxygen carried by the 1 gram of hemoglobin. So 1 gram of hemoglobin carries about 1.34 ml of oxygen when it is 97% saturated. So we multiply it with 1.34 ml to get the oxygen carried by the hemoglobin level. So from this we can say that the deficiency of oxygen can occur at the tissue level when there is decrease in the arterial oxygen partial pressure. This is arterial oxygen partial pressure, that is the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood, because it will decrease the oxygen traveling in the dissolved form. So if there is decrease in the PaO2, the oxygen supply to the tissue in the dissolved form will be decreased. Secondly, if there is decrease in the hemoglobin level, if the hemoglobin concentration is get decreased, definitely the oxygen carried by the hemoglobin will be reduced. So the total arterial oxygen content will also be reduced. The third thing is that if the percentage of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin is reduced, here it is 97% saturated, then it carries 1.34 ml of oxygen. If that saturation is decreased, then this 1.34 ml value will also be get decreased. So what is the percentage of saturation of the hemoglobin also affects the total arterial oxygen content. So if that is reduced, in that case what will happen, the total arterial oxygen content will also be reduced. And the fourth thing is decrease in the blood flow. If the blood flow is decreased, what will happen? There is no blood to carry the oxygen, there is no plasma to carry the dissolved oxygen, there is no hemoglobin to carry the oxyhemoglobin. So there will be definitely deficiency of the oxygen at the tissue level. So now you understand the basic of the oxygen transport by the blood. It is transported in the dissolved form as well as in the binding form with the hemoglobin as the oxyhemoglobin. If there is decrease in PaO2, then there is decrease in the total arterial oxygen content because there is decrease in the dissolved form. Hemoglobin level decrease or the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin if reduced, there will be decrease in the total arterial oxygen content leading to hypoxia. And next thing is decrease in the blood flow. So what are the types of the hypoxia? Hypoxic hypoxia, anemic hypoxia, ischemic or the stagnant hypoxia, and the histotoxic hypoxia. So we will see that in all these types of hypoxia, what is decreased? Either there is a decrease in PaO2, or there is a decrease in the hemoglobin level, or there is a decrease in percentage saturation of hemoglobin, or there is any other cause which leads to hypoxia. So the first type of hypoxia is hypoxic hypoxia or the hypoxemia. It is the most common type of hypoxia. In this type of hypoxia, there is reduced PaO2. That means the partial pressure of the arterial blood is reduced. So if the partial pressure of the arterial blood is reduced, the dissolved form of oxygen, you can say the transportation of the oxygen via the dissolved form in the plasma will be reduced. And if the PaO2 is reduced, the arterial oxygen saturation of hemoglobin will be reduced, because the saturation of hemoglobin also depends upon the PaO2. So what will happen? The total arterial oxygen content will be reduced, the PaO2 is reduced, the hemoglobin level is normal because but because the PaO2 is reduced, the arterial oxygen saturation of the hemoglobin, that is the percentage saturation of the hemoglobin by the oxygen, will be reduced. The blood flow is also normal. So what are the causes of the hypoxic hypoxia and what is the mechanism behind this type of hypoxia? We will see now. So the first cause is the decreased barometric pressure. So we know that at the sea level, what is the barometric pressure at the sea level? It is 760 mmHg. So at the sea level, barometric pressure is 760 mmHg. When the person starts ascending on the mountain, what will happen? As the altitude is increasing, the atmospheric pressure starts decreasing. And we know that the atmosphere is a mixture of gases, and every gas exerts its pressure, and thus the sum of the pressure exerted by all the gases will be equal to the atmospheric pressure. So if we want to calculate the partial pressure of oxygen, we have to multiply the fraction component of the oxygen into the total atmospheric pressure, and that will give us the partial pressure of the oxygen. So if at the sea level we will calculate the partial pressure of oxygen, we need to multiply 21%, which is the fraction component of oxygen, into the 760, and we will get about 160 mmHg partial pressure at the sea level of the oxygen. But as the person starts ascending on the mountain, this atmospheric pressure starts declining, but still this fraction component remains the same. So what will happen? The PO2 gets decreased. So suppose the person is at the altitude now, and the barometric pressure is now reduced to 600 mmHg. So if the PO2 is now 600 mmHg, what will happen? The barometric pressure will be PaO2 or the PO2 now is less than 160 mmHg. It is less than 160 mmHg. So what is happening? If the atmospheric PaO2 is less, definitely the inspired air PO2 will also be less. The alveolar, that is the partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveoli, will also be less, and the partial pressure of the arterial oxygen will also be less. Okay, so if the arterial oxygen partial pressure is less, what will happen? The oxygen saturation of the hemoglobin will be less, and the dissolved form of the oxygen in the plasma will also be less. So the total arterial oxygen content will be less, leading to hypoxia. Which type of hypoxia? Hypoxic hypoxia. So in the hypoxia, what is happening in the first cause is that there is decrease in the barometric pressure, which occurs at the high altitude, because the fraction component remains the same, but the atmospheric pressure declines when the person starts ascending on the mountain. So the PO2 is decreased, the PiO2, that is the inspired air PO2, is also decreased, alveolar PO2 is also decreased, arterial blood PO2 is also decreased. So the total arterial oxygen content will also be reduced. Now we move on to the second cause of the hypoxia, hypoxic hypoxia. So that is the respiratory diseases. Number one is the obstructive lung disease. So obstructive lung disease is associated with what? It is associated with hypoventilation. Hypoventilation means decrease in the amount of the air which is entering inside the lung. So if there is less air, what will happen? If there is less air, the alveolar PO2 is get reduced, and if the alveolar PO2 is get reduced, the arterial PaO2 will also automatically reduced. Look, if there is increase in, the oxygen has to diffuse from the alveoli into the blood, into the artery. So if there is increase in the alveolar O2, definitely there is increase in the arterial O2. And if there is decline in the alveolar O2, there will be decline in the arterial O2. So hypoventilation leads to the decline in the alveolar O2, and there is decline in the arterial O2 simultaneously. Another defect is the diffusion defect. So what happens in the diffusion defect? We know that the blood has to transfuse. It has to diffuse from the alveolar to the artery. Okay, so if the membrane gets thickened, if the diffusion barrier or the diffusion membrane is thickened, the diffusion will be declined, because diffusion is inversely proportional to the surface, to the thickness of the membrane. Okay, diffusion is inversely proportional to the thickness of the membrane. So the diffusion will be declined as the thickness of the membrane is increased. So even though the alveolar PO2 is normal in the case of diffusion defect, but the arterial O2 is decreased because there is defect in diffusion. Next is respiratory failure. In the respiratory failure, again there is hypoventilation. So what will happen? There will be decrease in the alveolar O2 as well as decrease in the arterial O2, PO2. Then there is VQ imbalance. V stands for ventilation, Q stands for perfusion. There are some alveoli in the lung which are unventilated, but they are well perfused. So these type of alveoli will lead to right or left shunt, because the blood around the unventilated alveoli still will contribute to the shunt, because they have the composition of the unoxygenated blood. Their oxygen content is not increased, because the blood in that capillary is surrounding the alveoli, which is underventilated, which is not ventilated. So in that case there will be right to left shunt. Next defect is the circulatory defect, like if there is a septal defect in the heart. So if there is a septal defect, what will happen? The right side of the blood will go to the left side of the heart. Okay, right side blood of the heart will go to the left side of the heart, and there will be mixing of the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood. So there will be decrease in the PaO2. So when there is decrease in the PaO2, there will be which type of hypoxia? Hypoxic hypoxia. So always remember, in the hypoxia there is decrease in the arterial PaO2. Okay, definitely there is decrease in the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin also, but the primary reason is the decrease in the PaO2. Okay, then we move on to the next type of the hypoxia, called as the anemic hypoxia. So anemic hypoxia is one. Here what is happening? The hemoglobin is not there to carry the oxygen. Okay, the O2 PO2 is normal. There is no problem in the atmosphere. Okay, there is no problem in the lungs. Oxygenation is perfect, and there is no diffusion defect. Diffusion is perfect. Okay, but still there is hypoxia, because the hemoglobin levels are not normal, they are less in the blood. So PO2 is normal because atmosphere is normal and the lungs are also normal, so PO2 is normal, but hemoglobin levels are reduced. That is why the arterial oxygen content is reduced. Okay, what are the causes here? The causes are, number one cause is the anemia, decrease in the hemoglobin level or decrease in the number of RBC. Next is the carbon monoxide poisoning. So how the carbon monoxide poisoning leads to anemia, anemic hypoxia, we will see in the upcoming slide. Altered hemoglobin means what? Means that the normal hemoglobin is not there to carry the oxygen. So if the hemoglobin is not there to carry the oxygen, definitely the oxygen carried by the hemoglobin will be reduced and the arterial oxygen content will be reduced. So I forget to mention 2-3 terms in the previous slide, so we will cover it first. Okay, so yes, here I have also mentioned in the table cyanosis. Cyanosis means what? The bluish discoloration of the skin and the mucous membrane because of the presence of the deoxyhemoglobin more than 5g% in the capillary blood. So there is deoxyhemoglobin in the blood. Why? Because PO2 is less. If the PO2 is less, the oxygen saturation of the hemoglobin is less, but the hemoglobin level is normal. So if the hemoglobin level is normal and there is less saturation of hemoglobin, what will be the other type of hemoglobin present in the blood? It will be deoxyhemoglobin, because the hemoglobin level is normal. So that deoxyhemoglobin level is more, that's why it leads to cyanosis. Then there is stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptor means the aortic and the carotid chemoreceptors. So they basically sense what? They sense the arterial O2 and they sense the arterial CaO2 and they sense the H+ concentration of the artery. So when there is decline in the PaO2, they get stimulated and they will cause the hyperventilation. So as there is a decline in the PaO2 in the hypoxia, there will be stimulation of the peripheral chemoreceptors. Then the arterial venous difference of the PO2. So this difference is decreased. Why? Because the arterial PO2 is already less. So definitely the difference between the artery and the venous PO2 will be decreased. Okay, then we move on to the anemic hypoxia, which we were discussing. and here also cyanosis is absent. Why? Because there is no hemoglobin is less. For cyanosis to be present, hemoglobin must be there, so but hemoglobin is reduced, that's why there is no cyanosis in the case of anemic hypoxia. Stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptors, no stimulation. Why? Because PO2 is normal. If PO2 is normal, there will be no stimulation. Then arterial venous PO2 difference, it will be normal because the PO2 is normal. Okay, so these are the terms which you have to remember. You have to understand that why it is no here, why it was yes there, and why it is normal there, but it was decreased in the hypoxia. Now we look at the carbon monoxide poisoning. So carbon monoxide has 210 times more affinity for the hemoglobin than the oxygen. So it has a very great affinity for the hemoglobin. So because of this affinity, very high affinity of the carbon monoxide for the hemoglobin, just a alveolar PCO of 0.4 mmHg is sufficient to produce the carbon monoxyhemoglobin. And it basically, the carbon monoxide binds with hemoglobin to form the carbomonoxyhemoglobin or the carboxyhemoglobin. Now the carbon monoxyhemoglobin cannot take up the oxygen, and this is the reason why the carbon monoxide poisoning leads to the anemic hypoxia. In the anemia, what happens? In the anemia, the person is lacking with the hemoglobin. He or she doesn't have the enough hemoglobin levels in the blood, and that is why there is hypoxia. Here the hemoglobin level is normal, the person has a normal hemoglobin, still there is anemic hypoxia because the available hemoglobin binds with the carbon monoxide, and that carbon monoxide is not allowing the hemoglobin to take up the oxygen and deliver the oxygen to the tissues. Alright, so carbon monoxyhemoglobin or the carboxyhemoglobin, it doesn't allow the remaining hemoglobin to take up the oxygen and to release the oxygen, and that is why there is anemia. So what does the carboxyhemoglobin do? It actually shifts the oxygen dissociation curve to the left side. Okay, so this is the oxygen dissociation curve. This is a normal case. This one is a normal case in which there is oxygen and the hemoglobin concentration is also normal, that is 14 gram%. And in this case, what is happening? This shows a sigmoidal curve. Now what happens when a person has an anemia? When the person has a 50% of the hemoglobin, but that 50% hemoglobin is a normal hemoglobin and there is no carbon monoxide. At that case, this is the graph. Okay, but what happens when there is carbon monoxide poisoning? Even though there is normal hemoglobin, but still what is happening? The oxygen dissociation curve is shifted towards the left by the carboxyhemoglobin. 50% of hemoglobin is the carboxyhemoglobin and the remaining 50% is a normal hemoglobin. But that remaining 50% hemoglobin is not able to release the oxygen. Okay, why? Because the carboxyhemoglobin has shifted the curve towards the left, and when the oxygen dissociation curve shifts towards the left, it means that there is increase in the affinity of the hemoglobin for the oxygen. So when there is increase in the affinity of the hemoglobin for the oxygen, that means that hemoglobin will not be able to release the oxygen to the tissues. So 50% hemoglobin is the carboxyhemoglobin that cannot take up the oxygen because carbon monoxide is not allowing it to take up the oxygen, and the remaining 50%, which is actually the HbO2 oxyhemoglobin, is not able to release the oxygen to the tissues. Cannot release oxygen to tissues. So you can see what does the carbon monoxide do. So now, we move to the previous slide. Yes. So it shifts the oxygen dissociation curve of the remaining HbO2 to the left and hence decrease the release of O2. That is why when an anemic individual who has a 50% of normal HbO2 can work moderately, but an individual which has the 50% normal hemoglobin and 50% carboxy hemoglobin cannot do any work. Why? Because no oxygen is available to the cell. 50% carboxy hemoglobin cannot take up the oxygen, and the remaining 50% HbO2 is not able to release the oxygen because the oxygen dissociation curve is shifted to the left side of the oxygen dissociation curve. Okay, so I hope this point is clear to you, that how carbon monoxide poisoning leads to the anemic hypoxia. Then no cyanosis can develop as there is carboxy hemoglobin, and carboxy hemoglobin is cherry red in color, so no bluish discoloration can be seen in the skin and in the mucous membrane. There will be no or little stimulation of the carotid and the aortic chemoreceptors because PO2 is normal. Then we move on to the next type of the hypoxia, which is the ischemic hypoxia or the stagnant hypoxia. So in this type of hypoxia, the atmosphere is normal, so the PO2 is normal. Oxygenation and the diffusion at the lungs is also normal. The PO2 is normal. Hemoglobin is normal. Hemoglobin saturation is also normal. Arterial oxygen content is normal, but the blood flow is not normal. The blood flow is reduced. And when there is a lack of blood supply, what will happen? There will be no plasma to carry the dissolved form of oxygen. There is no hemoglobin to carry the oxyhemoglobin. So definitely there will be deficiency of the oxygen at the tissue level. The causes are circulatory failure, as in the shock, there is decrease in the cardiac output, so there is decrease in the blood flow. In the case of blockages by the atherosclerosis, like in the coronary artery disease, stroke, peripheral arterial disease, and in the pulmonary embolism. So there is a blockage which basically doesn't allow the blood to move forward. Okay, then cyanosis is present in this case. Why? Because there is no blood flow. So there is no blood flow, so definitely what will happen? There will be bluish discoloration. Stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptors will be there because there is no blood flow, so there will be decreased PO2 detected by the cells. There is no blood flow, so what will happen? No PO2 is there, which will be sensed by the peripheral chemoreceptors. So there will be stimulation of the peripheral chemoreceptors, and the arterial venous PO2 difference will be more than normal. Why? Because there is no arterial supply to the tissues. So what will happen? There is no arterial supply to the tissues because of blockage. So what will happen? The tissues start extracting the oxygen present in the venous blood. Okay, so the venous PO2 will be get declined. So what will happen? The difference will increase. Okay, the difference will become more than normal. Then we move on to the next type of the hypoxia, called as the histotoxic hypoxia. So it is the inability of the tissue to utilize the oxygen. Everything is normal here. The arterial oxygen content is normal, PO2 is normal, hemoglobin is normal, blood flow is also normal, but the tissue has the abnormality. It has some kind of poisoning, like in the cyanide poisoning. The cyanide inhibits the cytochrome oxidase, and it results in the inhibition of the oxidative process. Diphtheria also leads to the inhibition of the cytochromes and the inhibition of the oxidative process. So there is a abnormality at the tissue. The tissue is not able to utilize the oxygen. So cyanosis will be absent here. Why? Because the blood has the oxygen. Blood is perfectly fine. Blood has proper oxyhemoglobin, but the tissue is not able to take it. So cyanosis will be absent. Stimulation of peripheral chemoreceptors? Yes, because the chemoreceptors are not able to utilize the oxygen. So they will think that there is a problem in the blood. Okay. Then arterial venous PO2 difference will be less than normal. Why? Because arterial PO2 remains the same. Arterial PO2 is coming, it is supplying the oxygen to the cells, but the cell is not able to take up the oxygen, so that total oxygen is again going back. So arterial and the venous oxygen, or the arterial or the venous PO2 is same. It is same because the tissues are not able to take up the oxygen from the capillaries. So there will be no difference in the arterial and the venous PO2 concentration. Okay, I hope it is clear to you. Then the treatment which is given in the histotoxic hypoxia is the methylene blue or the nitrites, and they will bind to the hemoglobin to form the methemoglobin, and methemoglobin will bind to cyanide to form the cyan-methemoglobin, and it is a non-toxic compound. So this is a treatment which is given in the histotoxic hypoxia. Then we move on to the effects of hypoxia. So hypoxia leads to what? It leads to the formation of hypoxia inducible factors. So these are basically the transcription factors. Transcription factors, what they do when the hypoxia come, these are also found when there is no hypoxic stimulus. Okay, during that time, what happened, that the alpha subunit of the hypoxic inducible factor is destroyed in a cell. But when there is a hypoxia, the two subunits of this factor will dimerize. They dimerize and then they activate the gene which causes the formation of the various proteins, such as angiogenic factors and the erythropoietin. So these factors or these proteins actually help the cell to overcome the condition of the hypoxia. They actually help the cell to survive the conditions of the hypoxia. Okay, then we move on to the next, which is on the brain. What is happening, like impaired judgment, okay, nausea, anorexia, vomiting, tachycardia. These are the features which are seen during the hypoxia. On lungs, what will happen? There will be dyspnea. Dyspnea is basically the difficulty in the breathing, when the person feels that he or she is requiring certain kind of labor to do the breathing. Okay, breathing becomes difficult during the hypoxia. Then oxygen therapy. So oxygen therapy is the therapy where we give the oxygen inhalation to the patient. So the effectiveness of the oxygen therapy actually varies. It is more effective in the hypoxia, but not that much effective in the other types of hypoxia. The principle, or you can say the mechanism of the oxygen therapy, is that it will increase the PaO2, that is, it will increase the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. Because what we are doing, we are giving the oxygen to the patient. The patient is inhaling the oxygen. So we are increasing the inhaled partial pressure of oxygen. And if the inhaled partial pressure of oxygen is increased, the alveolar PaO2 will be increased. And if the alveolar PaO2 is increased, the arterial PaO2 will be increased. So as a result, we are basically increasing what? We are basically increasing the partial pressure of the oxygen. So it is effective in the hypoxia, but not effective in the AV shunts. AV shunts, because the defect is at the heart level. Whatever amount of oxygen you will apply to it, there is shunt. So it will not gonna help that much. Then not effective in stagnant hypoxia, as the tissues don't get the enough blood supply. Not effective in histotoxic hypoxia, as the tissues are not able to utilize the oxygen. So this is the summary. This table I have taken from G.K. Pal, textbook of medical physiology. This is an excellent table for hypoxia. All the points we have discussed are covered in this. So if you like this video, please like, share and comment. Follow HM Learnings on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, where I share regular updates that can help you to rock your Viva and in boosting your knowledge. Comment down if you have any doubt. Till then, keep learning.